Russell Wilson being traded from the Seattle Seahawks to the Denver Broncos. I think the Broncos are going to try to tell everyone with a straight face that Russell Wilson was the first choice. The timing would suggest otherwise, but that's fine. They got their guy. They have their quarterback. George Paton told me last week the urgency on a scale of 1 to 10 was a 10 to address the quarterback position, and I would say they have acted accordingly, giving up a lot to get a quarterback that they think will get them over the top.
Well, and they did it by signing Peyton Manning a few years ago, and since then they've started 11 quarterbacks, which is tied with Washington for the most in the league. So they couldn't get it done through the draft. They repeatedly tried that and didn't get that right. So now they've obviously gotten it right. Mike gave up a lot to get him, but I think it's a move they had to make, don't you? I don't feel like this is a team that's a quarterback away from winning now. But to me, this is a long-term thing for the Broncos. I mean, he's 33 years old. They're obviously going to re-sign him before his contract expires in 2 seasons. So this is a long-term trade for the Broncos looking ahead, and this is going to be a long-term relationship. So the Broncos do feel like they have a chance now to win a Super Bowl going ahead, whether it's this year or whether it's another year.
When they got Peyton Manning, they gave up nothing to get him because he had been cut.
Right.
By the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts didn't even get a compensatory draft pick because they cut Peyton Manning. This time around, they give up 7 assets, 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, a flip-flop of a 5th round and a 4th round pick. That really doesn't count. And then 3 players. You saw the names on the screen: Drew Lock, Shelby Harris, and Noah Fant. So they're giving up a ton to get Russell Wilson. And you mentioned he's under contract for 2 more years. He's due to make $51 million. We know what the pattern is for Russell Wilson. He gets his next contract with 1 year left on his current deal. And for all we know, he's going to press to get a new contract right now. Remember, Mark Rodgers, his agent, has one client. He's the Tom Hagen of NFL agents. So he doesn't have to worry about how being a pain in the butt on behalf of one client may affect the interests of other clients. There isn't this broader dance you have to do to preserve relationships. Your relationship is with your client to get the best deal you can. And Shireen, the Broncos have to go into this clear-eyed, understanding that come next year, they're going to have to make Russell Wilson one of the highest-paid players in all of football. And how can they say no after giving up 7 assets to get him? And I'll take it one step farther. No deal's done until Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. I don't know how the no-trade clause works from the standpoint of saying, I'm fine with it and having a change of heart. What if he decides over the course of the next week, you know what? I want my new contract now. He's got all the power in the world. If Mark Rodgers wants to push the Broncos to make him $50 million per year plus $1, so he's just ahead of Aaron Rodgers, he's never going to have more power than he has right now because he could blow the whole thing up between now and next Wednesday.
Oh, he has the Broncos over the barrel, and they knew that going in, that if they gave up this much to get Russell Wilson, that they were going to give him a new contract at some point to keep him long term. This isn't a 2-year rental, certainly, and we know Russell Wilson probably isn't going to play for his current contract next year, not when we've seen what quarterback salaries have done and are about to do with Aaron Rodgers getting his new deal. So, he's got a $19 million base this season and $22 million base next season. He's going to want more money and going to want it pretty quickly. If not now, then certainly after this season, Mike. And he's going to get that because that's what the Broncos agreed to when they made this trade was Russell Wilson is now our longtime quarterback. And they feel like they finally have him. So he's going to get his money. He's going to get paid. And to me, it almost seems like maybe that was part of the Seahawks thinking. They didn't want to go there with Russell Wilson. They didn't want to pay that money that it was going to keep Russell Wilson in Seattle.
Something I said last week. They're deciding to get what they can now instead of next year because next year the trade would have happened with the certainty that whoever does the deal is going to have to pay Russell Wilson. This time they move him where all they have to do is take on the contract. Next year, the existing contract. Next year, they'd have to pay him and they would give up less. It's always a balance. How much you have to pay the player, how much you have to give the team. And if you have to give the player a major contract on the way through the door, you're less inclined to pay the team. But I don't want to gloss over the possibility that Wilson could say, $19 million base salary and $5 million roster bonus, that's $24 million. You got Aaron Rodgers making $50. You got Patrick Mahomes making $45. I know my contract was front-loaded, but it was at an average of $35. Something's wrong with this picture. I want it now. If he says I want it now, and he could just blame his agent. Sorry, my agent told me to do it. If Mark Rodgers says, I want it now, he wants it now, he gets it now, what's George Payton going to say? No? And then all Russell Wilson has to say is, fine, I don't waive my no-trade clause. I mean, I really don't think any of it's binding. And I'm going to have to look into this to be 100% sure. But the idea that you can't actually do the trade until next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, I would tend to believe that Russell Wilson's consent to be traded doesn't become binding until then either. And until then, it is something he could revoke. So I agree with you. Seahawks looked at this as, let's just do it now. Because next year, we're going to have to pay him. Next year, somebody's going to have to pay him. Let's just do it now. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off now. We have no intention to trade Russell Wilson. We knew when we heard it that meant for sale sign is in the yard, come change our intention, and the Broncos did. Hell, the talks were happening. This has been percolating for a month. It was in process. So I love chaos. Chaos is good for business. Days like today are great for business. And there's a wrinkle to this. There's a chaotic wrinkle to this where Wilson could say, oh, by the way, Broncos, you better go ahead and give me my contract now. And he'd be within his rights to do it because $24 million isn't enough.
No, absolutely, Mike. He's going to be one of the biggest value. If he does play for that this season, he's going to be one of the biggest values at quarterback in the NFL, and the Broncos better use that as they can because his price is only going to go up after this season. But I would expect that new contract to come sooner than later, certainly, Mike. But this has always seemed like an inevitability that he was going to be traded from the Seahawks since last January when his frustrations bubbled up publicly in that interview. And he talked about being involved in personnel, and he talked about how bad his offensive line was, and he's tired of taking hits and everything else he said last January. This just felt like his days in Seattle were numbered. And then, of course, Mark Rodgers comes out and says, well, we don't want to trade, but if the Seahawks are going to entertain trade talks, then here's the 4 teams that he would waive his no-trade clause to. And since then, it's just felt like that was going to happen. And today it finally happened of him being traded to the Broncos. So no surprise that this happened. I think we all saw it coming, Mike. It maybe just took a little longer than we thought it might take. Do you think that the Seahawks would have gotten more for Russell Wilson a year ago if they had done this, or would they have gotten more next year if they had done this?
They wouldn't have gotten more next year. I'm convinced they wouldn't have gotten more next year because next year you'd have to give them a huge contract on the way through the door.
Yep.
Last year, they may have gotten more. They didn't get 3 first-round picks. Didn't they turn down 3 first-round picks last year from the Chicago Bears? Wasn't that one of the packages that was out there? And wasn't that one of the teams on his short list of teams he would play for? Look, I think last year he dipped. Now, the finger injury had a lot to do with it. His final stats weren't horrible, but something that I've noticed, he doesn't move like he used to. He doesn't have the same mobility and elusiveness that he once had. And that's fine. Not everyone is going to continue to be able to run like they did in their 20s. But that's a factor in all this. It's going to be interesting to see what he does on a team that has more around him. And he's jumping into a division where he's going to have Patrick Mahomes twice a year, Justin Herbert twice a year, Derek Carr twice a year. He's going to be competing beyond his division in the conference for playoff seeding with Josh Allen and the Bills, Joe Burrow and the Bengals, Lamar Jackson and the Ravens, Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars. If Trevor Lawrence becomes the real deal as the number 1 overall pick in the draft, he's stepped into a much tougher spot. But you know what, Shireen? I think that he's still in a better position to win a Super Bowl with the Broncos than if he stayed with the Seahawks. Because right now the Seahawks are in I don't know what phase. Rebuilding, reloading, reshuffling, retooling, regurgitating. I don't know. and especially without Russell Wilson, surely Drew Lock isn't the answer. Surely they have a better plan, all due respect, than Drew Lock at quarterback. And I was talking to somebody about it today, and the suggestion was, well, the Seahawks will just draft somebody. Well, they may as well have a sign, you know, the old kick me sign that they'd put on your back? They may as well have a leapfrog me sign on their backs as their pick approaches in round one, because that's going to be the clear point of delineation where if you want a quarterback, you better cut the line in front of the Seattle Seahawks. And we know that throughout the first round of the draft, they will be potentially trying to trade up to get in position to get whoever they really like, if that's what they plan to do. Now, I don't know that taking a quarterback in round one is the right way for the Seahawks to go, because it hasn't exactly worked out. I think of guys like Rick Meyer and Dan McGuire. They got Russell Wilson because he fell to them in round 3, but they may get a little desperate now to try to package some of that stuff they got for Wilson to enhance their opportunity to draft a quarterback. And that's the other side of this too. Maybe they really like one of these guys that's coming out in the draft.
Well, and that could be, Mike. If that's the case, then good for them. They'll draft one of those guys. You would also think maybe that now that they have all these picks that they're doing their due diligence on a guy like Deshaun Watson, and maybe that would be a possibility. The only reason this doesn't make sense to me, it makes a lot of sense in a lot of different areas that we've talked about, but the one way it doesn't make sense to me is the age of your coach. Pete Carroll is 71 years old, and to me, this just doesn't look like a guy who's in it for the long, based on his age, in it for the long haul to rebuild this team. And right now, if you look at their team, Bobby Wagner is the lone guy left from their Super Bowl season, and he might not be there for long. He might not play there in 2022. So they could have completely cleared out that entire Super Bowl team and be starting over. And this just doesn't look like a team that's even close to being a Super Bowl team. Perhaps even if they get a guy like Deshaun Watson, I don't know that I like their chances when we talk about the competition in the NFC West. It's awfully tough in that division. That's the toughest division, obviously, in the NFC to win. So they've got a lot of things to do here, and I know they've looked ahead. They didn't just make this trade and go, okay, now what do we do at quarterback? I know they have some kind of plan, and maybe they think they're going to fall into another Russell Wilson, but let me just tell you, that doesn't happen. You look at the Broncos and how they've drafted quarterbacks and how it didn't work out for them. There's an awful lot of quarterbacks who are drafted that are probably worse than they are better when you draft a quarterback. You just don't know what you're getting.
They drafted Brock Osweiler in round 2 the year that Russell Wilson fell to round 3. That just shows you what's going on. Now, I don't think that a short quarterback, 6 foot or under, I don't think that's going to result in a guy sliding like it once did, because we now know that those guys can still play. But still, you never know where that quarterback's going to come from. And the harder you try to make a first-round pick into your guy, the harder it is. And there's more pressure on that guy that's taken in round 1, especially if they decide to go with a first-round pick. And the more I think about it, the more we talk about it, Shereen, I don't think they should, because that guy's going to be under tremendous pressure to come through the door and pick up the reins that Russell Wilson left behind with a team that isn't anywhere close to being as good as it was when Russell Wilson arrived 10 years ago. And by the way, this trade to the Broncos is happening 1 day short of the 10-year anniversary of their initial meeting with Peyton Manning. So here they are after a revolving door, 6 years of Brock Osweiler, Trevor Siemian. Who else? God, I'm sure they don't want to remember who else that they tried at quarterback. They used a first-round pick on Paxton Lynch. How did that go?
Simeon.
Not too good. Case Keenum, I mentioned Trevor Siemian. Joe Flacco was there at one point. It's just been a mess. And now they get their guy. And I really am going to be curious to see what Russell Wilson still has left. And I'm sure he'll redouble his efforts to be ready to go. Oh, and by the way, he gets to play all of his old friends and foes in the NFC West this year. Yes, the Broncos go to Seattle during the regular season. All of a sudden, that becomes a game that you circle with red ink as we wait for the schedule to release. Usually it is now May. Usually it's been 1 year or two since they moved it to May, and they like it in May after the draft. The Broncos at the Seahawks is going to be a huge, huge game for which the networks are going to be jostling, because that's going to be Russell Wilson's return to Seattle. And I bet it happens in the first month of the season before either team declares itself to be not a contender. I could see this being like almost like last year, Week 4 Sunday night. Doesn't that make sense? Tom Brady back to New England.
Absolutely.
I think Week 4 Sunday night, or Monday night or Thursday night. Not that they'll give it to Thursday night, not on Amazon. But either Monday night or Sunday night, I could see Russell Wilson going back to Seattle. It's going to make for a fascinating. We're already starting to see the pieces fall together on what's going to be interesting this year. And boom, all the AFC West games, the round robin there twice. Any other games that the Broncos may have in the AFC? I think they play the Ravens this year. Maybe they play the Bengals too. I'm going to have to look at that. But the schedule gets very interesting now that we know their quarterback is Russell Wilson, assuming he doesn't pull the plug between now and Wednesday.
Mike, when you and I grew up, quarterbacks stayed in one place forever. The Roger Staubachs and those guys, they were there forever mostly. And when Joe Montana left and went to Kansas City, it was a really big deal when those guys moved because it just didn't happen very often. And then when you had unfettered free agency in the early 1990s, we still didn't see a ton of big movement of quarterbacks because when you found that guy, you wanted to keep that guy and you wanted to keep him forever. And so you had the Troy Aikmans and all those guys who stayed in one place. And it was rare when a guy went somewhere else to finish his career. And now I kind of like it. Guys are moving around, and it's been fun these last 3 years to see quarterbacks go different places and try to win different places. And guess what? The last 2 years, it's worked beautifully for the Buccaneers in getting Tom Brady in free agency. And then this year with the Rams trading for Matthew Stafford, both in their first year at those teams. So I think we're going to see more and more of this, that teams aren't just going to stand pat. They aren't going to just go in the draft and go, well, we'll take our chances on this guy again. I think you're going to see more and more teams go after the proven commodity, and those guys are going to be available on the trade market. So we could see more of these things this year, next year, and years beyond.
And I remember when we were kids, remember the big trade, the big quarterback for quarterback trade? Well, of course, you lived there. You were close to it. It was Dan Pastorini for Ken Stabler. Remember?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I was stunned by that. And it didn't happen. That did not happen. And we haven't seen a quarterback for quarterback trade recently, but the idea that a quarterback can't get traded. And this goes back to, and this is a chapter in Playmakers, by the way, available now at 20% off at Amazon. And by the way, if you've already ordered at Amazon, I'm told that you get the 20% discount. So you have that going for you, which is nice. But one of the chapters there was driven by Tom Brady's jump from the Patriots to the Buccaneers, and it shows how much power quarterbacks now have, and they have a ton of it. And Russell Wilson didn't even have to use it this year. It was the residual effect of last year that set it up for this year. He wisely didn't rattle the cage this year, and maybe he knew. Maybe they had the conversation last year. We don't know what happens behind the scenes. We know that they tell us one thing and they do something else. Maybe they agreed that after 2021 they'd look at where things stood, and they played it very deftly. They got maximum compensation, and one of the ways you get maximum compensation is you act like you're not as anxious to make a trade as you otherwise would seem to be. The only downside from Russell Wilson's standpoint, the team he's going to is giving up a hell of a lot of stuff to get him. You don't want your team to give up 2 first-round picks, 2 second-round picks, and 3 quality players, although who cares about Drew Lock? Get him out of here. But other than that, 6 pieces that could help Russell Wilson win games, they're gone now. And there's not much you can do if you really want out, but that's just part of the reality for Russell Wilson. And if he had been agitating even harder to get out, it may have been harder for the Seahawks to get that full complement. So it's a professional. Everyone was professional here. And it worked out fine, and Russell Wilson would have stayed if they weren't able to work out a deal, but they got it worked out. No intention to trade 6 days ago became an intention to trade 8 days from now. And again, I'm not trying to be a killjoy here. We just have to recognize one of these trades that gets lined up before 4 p.m. on the first day of the new league year is not going to go through. One of these days it's going to happen. We've seen players who do deals in that 2-day window ultimately not sign them. One of these days, a team is going to say, we're not going through with the trade, or a player who has a no-trade clause is going to decide not to waive it between the day the trade was tentatively done and the day that arrives for the trade to be official. We just have to keep an eye on that. The one time we don't, Shireen, is the time it's going to happen.
Oh, no question, Mike. And it's not official until it's official, right? And it's so we're still a week away from it becoming official. So anything could happen in that time. And You know, the Commanders, we know, offered, according to a report, first-round draft picks in 2022, 23, 24. Russell Wilson had that no-trade clause, though, Mike. He got to say where he wanted to go. If you're Russell Wilson, where would you have chosen to go? What team? Because the Broncos, to me, like I said, I think this is a long-term deal. I get that. But to me, they just don't look like they're a quarterback away. To me, there are other teams, especially in the NFC, that maybe more look like they're a quarterback away, and maybe it's a little bit easier to.
Hi, I'm Mike Tirico, and thanks for watching. Make sure to hit subscribe for the latest news and highlights from NBC Sports.